Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the show. As our IT-centric community expands into different worlds and different applications and having to have conversations between on-prem and off-prem and cloud, there's so many questions that pop up from a challenges standpoint, an opportunities standpoint. And today I want to try and provide a little bit more clarity, specifically in that world of cloud-centric ecosystems. And, especially as we kind of step through a lot of different digital transformation, opportunities, the cloud really continues to present itself as a unique opportunity because of scalability, opportunity, cost savings, and a lot of applications. But I want to step through some of those best practices, those challenges, and maybe some of those ways to best roll out a cloud-centric ecosystem. And to have that conversation today, I brought on somebody who's far more knowledgeable about these things than I am, which is the greatest guest in the world that you could possibly bring on. And that's Chris McHenry, VP of Product Management from Aviatrix. Chris, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Ben. It's really good to be here.
Well, Chris, I want to kind of give you the floor here to kick us off. I know that obviously Aviatrix is doing some fantastic stuff from a cloud solutions provider standpoint, especially from a management and standpoint of day-to-day activities. But I want to ask, some of our audience may not be quite familiar with who Aviatrix is. Who would you say that Aviatrix is, especially in relation to kind of the cloud computing world?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's funny because we're not really that new of a company. We were born as cloud was kind of taking off. And I think one of the things that's really brought us into more prominence over the last couple of years is I believe that, we've done a really great job of continuing to innovate as the company has evolved. But B, cloud has continued to just explode in relevance. And one of the things that we're finding is that, customers are, and organizations, enterprises, our customers are, kind of dabbled in the cloud maybe 4 or 5 years ago and have started to grow and become, have more complex environments and more complex requirements. And what's also really interesting is we see different skill sets now becoming responsible for things that they may not have, to your point, like the most expertise in. The application teams are now responsible for security and connectivity and a bunch of other things, right? So we live in that space. We were born as a company with the whole premise of, how can I take some of those core traditional IT requirements, things like networking and network security and firewalling and the ability to troubleshoot things and make sure that connectivity is resilient. Those things that were done maybe by the Ciscos of the world when they were on-prem, or the Palo Alto networks. And we want to rethink how we do that for the cloud. So fundamentally, we really live in that networking and network security space, primarily in alignment and in partnership with a lot of the major cloud vendors, the AWSs, Azures, GCPs, even, for if you're bigger, older school enterprises, the Oracles and of the world. And that's, our goal is to rethink how organizations do networking and network security in the cloud in a way that is optimized from the ground up for the cloud and is simplified to help make sure that the cloud operators can effectively leverage our solutions.
Well, Chris, I love that you even brought up some of those core distinctions, right? Obviously, there's a school of thought that is very on-prem centric, and if you need a fully insulated environment, maybe that's where you might want to go and leverage the cloud for some, whether it's external or other opportunities. But, I think the conversation around the cloud, as you mentioned, has evolved pretty dramatically, right? There's a different layer of security now, maybe even than 5-10 years ago. There's a different set of applications, and you've got operations teams, and you've got IT teams, and access control and security and teams trying to leverage these ecosystems, in the same way, right? So now it makes sense, especially as people are decentralized, to really explore a lot of those cloud solutions. Talk about some of the advantages specifically about maybe looking at a cloud-centric ecosystem versus a holistic, maybe on-prem solution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's multiples, right? But I mean, one of the big things that changes when organizations go to the cloud is that decentralization that you talked about beforehand, right? I mean, I tend to think that, organizations oftentimes go to the cloud because the applications are requiring it, right? Or there's optimization that can be had from the application teams or the developer teams, or that kind of perspective. But we almost get there first before thinking about how do we effectively secure it, or how do we effectively operationalize it, or how do we effectively cost optimize it as well. Like, to your point, some ways cloud can be less expensive. I'm not investing in a lot of this physical infrastructure anymore, but there's also a lot of risk when you move into a consumption-oriented model, right? That cost can get out of control. And if you don't do things right, you're going to end up with a suboptimal environment that could cost you a lot of money. So, when we think about looking at solutions that were born in the cloud, it's really about working with not necessarily fundamentally changing the way customers think about their IT infrastructure, to be perfectly honest, right? I mean, especially in the case of network security, which is something that I'm incredibly passionate about. It used to be that you could secure your environment, to your point, in kind of this isolated way where you stick a firewall at the edge of your network, and it's monitoring all your traffic and controlling how people access the real danger zone of the internet. And now we get to the cloud and it's like, oh shoot, I don't have a wall that I can put this thing in front of. And so what do I do? And there's several different options. You can try to force it, right? You can go to some of those legacy vendors and say, hey, okay, well, let me just replicate what I had on-prem, but I'm going to do it in software. Or I can rethink it for the cloud in the same way that well-architected frameworks in many of the clouds would advocate for refactoring or re-architecting applications. We need to think about doing that with the infrastructure and our cybersecurity practices as well, right? Doesn't necessarily mean we're changing the fundamentals. It's still very important to be able to see what's going in and out of my organization and to be able to control that and to be able to defend against it. But the mechanism or the architecture, or the way that we implement it might be slightly different. And the only way that you're really going to be able to capture the full benefits of the cloud, the speed, the automation, the cost optimization, is to really focus on doing maybe the same fundamental principles of implementing security, but doing it in a way that was really built for those new cloud operational models and cloud architectures.
Well, I think that's a great point too, right? And obviously you mentioned cybersecurity, and really it's the lens of our entire conversation today. On-prem is a little bit easier from a control standpoint, right? And there's no denying that, right? It's much easier for me to plug one cable in here and then plug it somewhere else, right? I have granular control over where that network goes. And I think a lot of times when people think about cloud migrations and cloud-centric ecosystems, they think, look, my threat now is less a cyber attack, or not specifically a cyber attack. My threat now is less a fire on site or somebody breaking in the middle of the night and stealing data. And it becomes more, my largest threat now is that somebody gets their password social engineered, right? What are some of those cybersecurity challenges specifically on the cloud that may differ a little bit from that on-prem as well?
Yeah, the big thing that I'll say with cloud in general, right? I mean, there's really two different categories of cloud consumption. Obviously, we have software as a service, and then we have kind of the infrastructure as a service realms. And a lot of that, when we think about security and really the responsibility that an organization has from an IT perspective, is about where does that line fall, right? I mean, when we talk about SaaS offerings, things like hosted email services and that kind of thing, absolutely. Password compromising, thinking about things like multi-factor authentication, those are really critical because, again, it used to be you would VPN into your network and that was your control point. And now we have to put the control point in the application. But I will say, I think, yes, absolutely. 100% still a massive problem. Social engineering is really challenging and it's a cat and mouse game. But, there's continued innovation in that space with identity and access management and, passwordless architectures and things along those lines that we should be thinking about. And a lot of people made significant improvements already with things like single sign-on. And we saw multi-factor authentication being a really big thing 4 or 5 years ago. It continues to be one of the most important things you can do from a security perspective. But then we have the infrastructure as a service, which is like I'm building this kind of software-defined replica of the things that we used to physically rack and stack in our data centers. And that has its own unique set of requirements, right? So maybe not necessarily about passwords as much, because the way that gets interacted with is more IT centric, or you're serving the application, or it's applications talking to other applications in the environment, and we need to focus on how do we secure those things. So two things that are really important to focus on. One, when you go to a cloud like an AWS, Azure, or GCP, your management framework is now on the internet. So we generally refer to this as like identity and access management, and may not be passwords. It might be things like access keys and credentials and those kinds of things. So that's fundamentally important to protect. Your management interfaces have never been on the internet before, and now they are. So we need to think about how to appropriately secure that. Relatively similar concepts to what we would do with SaaS. But then we think about, how do we secure those servers that we're deploying in the cloud and those applications that we're deploying in the cloud? And that's where I really think a lot of customers and a lot of enterprises struggle a little bit, because it's super, super easy to spin up an application in one of those providers. And their target audience really is the developer. And so the developer is not necessarily a security expert. Things like immediately getting access to the internet, or immediately having a public website. And all of a sudden, we don't have the same visibility and that same control that we had on premises. But that doesn't mean that those same principles shouldn't apply, right? If you go to organizations like MITRE, as an example, and you look at their attack matrix, they do have an attack matrix for cloud, but their standard attack matrix also is fully applicable for the applications, whether they're deployed on premise or whether they're deployed in the cloud. And so being able to do things like implement perimeter security controls are really, really important. So you might do it slightly differently. You're doing it in software. Some of the principles might change. And I think also sometimes the users might change. So driving simplicity in that is absolutely critical. And in terms of creating adoption and ultimately getting the most effective security posture. But yeah, we need to break the problem down. Like, there's elements of like, what do I do with SaaS and what do I do with applications that sit directly on the internet? And then there's how do I implement best practice security controls for the applications that I own and run, even though they're running in somebody else's environment and software.
One of the things that really stood out, about what you said is having different tiers or rollout strategies for your cloud specific security. And immediately my mind goes to, if I'm just an office that's trying to streamline some of my workflows and things like that, I won't need the level of cybersecurity or access control that a hospital would, right? Because there's different compliance standards, there's different regulation standards. But obviously, the give and take with that, aside from the appetite for risk, is pricing, right? And rollout strategy and data migration and all these different things. What would you say to somebody who's looking at maybe making that migration to the cloud specifically on, hey, what's appropriate for me to find that balance of, hey, I need this security, but I can't pay $300 million a year. I'm being dramatic, that, by the way. I can't pay $300 million to make sure that my data's secure. I'm in most cases it's not a $300 million budget, but there are those people who do spend that.
Yeah. So I think really a lot of this has to do with, where do you draw that line, right? And if you're in an organization where you don't have any expertise from a cybersecurity perspective, there's really two things I would look at. One is looking at services that have security built into them, or where there's this concept in the cloud of the shared security model, right? And it's who's responsible for what pieces of cybersecurity. And you need to evaluate, like, where does that level of responsibility live? And if I don't have that level of expertise, we want to move to solutions that have more built-in security versus security that you're responsible for. Now, there are a lot of, I think, opportunities as well. There's a lot of organizations out there that do security outsourcing, but to your point, that's relatively expensive. I'll tell you, my fundamental belief here at Aviatrix is that a lot of the foundational security principles that we that we did on premises still persist in the cloud. Having the ability to have like a firewall, as an example, that protects you, that has a good understanding from a vendor perspective of, what is a threat, what is not a threat, having good hygiene around what is allowed in and out of the firewall. Those are still like really, really good practices and the kinds of things that really any organization can operationalize. The catch is the complexity of what is conceptually complex for implementing those kinds of perimeter security controls in the cloud. And that's really where vendors like us come into play. It's building software that is simple, that is familiar, that can provide those basic foundational security controls in a very cost-effective way for really any organization looking to adopt a cloud strategy, right? So it's step one is understanding what am I responsible for based on the services that I'm using, and having a very clear understanding of that. And then if you have a use case, like you're developing your own applications or you're hosting your own applications, and that responsibility lies more on you than it does on the consumption of the provider that's providing the application for you, then thinking about, okay, how do I start from a first principles perspective, looking at things like MITRE ATT&CK matrix, making sure that I have the same things I had on-prem, like good antivirus, good visibility, good firewalling, good perimeter security control. Those are the places where I think, oftentimes, to be honest, a lot of people get stuck, is they think they get stuck in figuring out like what do I do in this new world, and the reality is you can take a lot of your historical skills and principles and apply those in the cloud. You need to likely work with a vendor who understands cloud as kind of the summary.
I like that you even mentioned those vendor relationships too, right? And especially for, what I would say the small, medium. When I say small, I'm probably talking 10-ish million and above, small, medium business that has to have some sort of security posture and cloud posture. It's very difficult, especially when you don't have the staffing capabilities to hire specifically for those applications, right? You might have somebody who's great with ISP management, and somebody who's great at email security and all these other things. But the challenge is, Chris, and this is what I want to ask is, when you talk about bringing that third party provider in, that typically for somebody is a pretty dramatic jump, right? They have acknowledged that they can't handle it on their own, but what specifically are those benefits of folks who maybe say, hey, you know what, I don't have the expertise, I don't have the time, I don't have the budget. Why would I want to go with a third party provider? And what are some of the things I should look for in a provider?
And I think there's a good, just in general element of core versus context, right? What is core to your business versus what is context to your business, right? And what we do see, to be perfectly honest, in the market right now is there is a huge skill gap, especially in cloud, and especially in the overlap between cloud connectivity, cloud security, right? And so whenever there's a skill gap, I mean, obviously, if you're looking at building out that expertise in-house, that's one thing. But if you can't hire for it, then that's an obvious reason to go look at a partner, right? Now, I do think there are two different kinds of partners, right? You have partners that you're going to outsource, labor to effectively, or, managed security operations centers, things like that, or full security stacks. That's one path to go. But the other path to go is to look at partners in kind of the software space that allow you to leverage transferable skills. Like one of the things that I look at when we build our software is I really want to think about what the user experience is like. And so as an example, we really strive to focus on simplicity and delivering powerful outcomes while making it easy to use. And we launched last year an embedded security component of our product, really focused around next generation firewalling. And as I was building that with my team, right, like as we were designing it, one of the big things that I really wanted to drive is I wanted to make sure that it was easy for the two stakeholders that really matter here. One is the IT administrator that is used to using a traditional firewall, the one who's used to working with a Palo Alto or a Checkpoint or a Fortinet or something along those lines. I wanted to make sure that it was familiar so you could log in and immediately understand, okay, I know how to use this thing, right? That way you don't necessarily have to hire for new skill sets. We can take those existing skill sets and easily transfer them into the new environment. And then the second user of the system is that app developer who doesn't really know much about security, but does know a lot about how to deploy things with code and that kind of thing. So making sure that that's really friendly for that particular user, and that we align with some of the paradigms that the cloud offers, so that again, familiarity, I think, really helps with allowing organizations to leverage existing skill sets to implement the criteria that they ultimately want. And so in that secondary path, it's not necessarily about a services provider and outsourcing to them. It's more maybe making sure that you have the right software stack, or that you've looked at the software ecosystem to see whether I can do something with the team that I already have.
Chris, I could even envision some of our audience right now just trying to absorb all this information and trying to drink from a fire hose. I think a good question might be, you've got people for the first time who, for one reason or another, are either trying to migrate from on-prem to cloud, or really are at the point where it makes sense for them to evaluate a larger data-centric strategy or cybersecurity strategy on the cloud. Where do you recommend that people start once they've decided that, hey, maybe there's a need there?
Exactly. So I will tell you one thing. One thing that the clouds are really good at is they've built these amazing marketplaces, right? And the marketplaces are really designed to help users discover offerings that are in the space that allow them to achieve the objectives, but do it in a cloud-centric way. So gives you the ability to kind of evaluate, new potential offerings that might fill some gaps that you knew how to fill on-prem, but you don't necessarily know how to fill in the cloud. So I recommend using the cloud provider marketplaces as a really interesting source of research. That's a primary way that we do transactions with our software. But the second thing that I really strongly encourage customers to think about is go back to the fundamentals, right? Use the resources that you have. There's amazing cybersecurity resources. There's amazing IT infrastructure resources. There's amazing certifications out there now. The things that we did earlier in our careers, and you're getting Microsoft certifications and Cisco certifications, obviously it makes sense to get AWS certifications and Azure certifications. And we have a program that we sponsor. Like, I'm a huge believer in empowering organizations through education. We have a program that we call ACE, which is the Aviatrix Certified Engineering Program, with associate, professional, and advanced level certifications. And so that education piece can be really helpful to developing a strategy. And then again, back to basics, right? Figuring out how I cover the same kind of basic needs that we had on premises. It's not like it fundamentally changes in cloud. You still need servers, you still need storage, you still need some sort of security, you still need some sort of networking. You need all the same things. It's about how do I transfer that knowledge and apply it in a similar way, but not necessarily thinking, oh, this is fundamentally different than anything I've done before.
Well, that's helpful. And I know that there are quite a few people out there who hear that and are comforted by that, right? It's intimidating at the very least to try and find, the best provider, the best, stack, the best cybersecurity plan and things like that. And working with folks like yourself, really to at the very least be a guide. Is wildly important, especially as the world changes pretty dramatically from a digital perspective every day. And I want to kind of give you this last question. This is there's a lot of different places you could go with this, but the world continues to evolve, right? And we've hit on that probably 400 times already in this episode. But what would you say are maybe some of the top 2 or 3 greatest risks that people need to be mindful of going into maybe the next 5-10 years when it comes to their cybersecurity posture?
Man, that is an interesting question.
I told you it was a big question.
Yeah. You never know. I honestly, I'll say this. I work with far too many customers where I think that cloud has, organization cybersecurity budgets, and it's obviously growing, and figuring out how we can have effective defense in a cost-effective way. And it has nothing to do with risk. It has nothing to do with the attackers. It has everything to do with our ability to prioritize best practice security. Right? It has to be affordable. It has to be accessible. And so I do think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. And I see that as a huge area for innovation. The interesting thing about a lot of the disruption that we see in the software space right now is that, at my phase, from a company perspective, I'm not trying to squeeze as much revenue out of every single customer as I'm trying to get. I'm trying to disrupt. I'm trying to disrupt and allow you to have accessible cybersecurity software. So I think that balance between cost and security posture is something that a lot of organizations are already wrestling with and will continue to wrestle with. There is a trade-off. There is a point where if you're spending so much on cybersecurity, you might as well just buy insurance, right? There's a ceiling. So that finding ways to do that. And now I think there's an ethical responsibility that we have as well, right? As companies, as we have customer data, as a company, as we're servicing our own clients and need to think about business continuity, there's this ethical responsibility that we're going to continue to deal with, which is prioritizing the security of our clients and prioritizing the continuity of our business, and those are huge challenges. And then the last piece I'll say is that this is a never-ending game. Unfortunately, right? It's a never-ending game. And the incentives for attackers are continuing to grow. AI is making it way easier for novices to develop malware and to do social engineering attacks, even if they don't have a good grasp, on the English language, right? Which we're seeing much better authored phishing emails with the advent of things like ChatGPT. So, it's a never-ending game, and you got to keep fighting. And that having that perseverance and the continued curiosity to continuously evaluate and reevaluate the strategy and the approach, and continue to educate the rest of the organizations on the importance of security. That perseverance, honestly, is going to be one of the biggest challenges that customers have.
Chris, I love that you even brought up the idea of ethics and cybersecurity. We probably have to get you on to have an entire conversation about that, because that's the underpinning of a lot of this, right? Is what ethical concerns, and especially when you start talking about financial loss and loss of care and all of these, it starts to get really wonky really, really quickly. But I'll tell you what, Chris, it was fantastic to have you on today and really set the table for a lot of folks who may not get to have this conversation all the time. So I appreciate you sharing your insight and coming on the show with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ben. Thanks for having me, and would love to come back.
Well, absolutely. We'd love to have you back on. And a giant thank you out to those who are listening and watching today. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you like what you saw, look, send me an email. We gotta have Chris back on for sure. And the more emails that I could send him about his positive experience, I'm sure we'll be able to pretty easily get him back on. But thanks so much for tuning in to Pro AV today. We are excited to have these conversations on the show, and look forward to serving the industry as we can continue to go forward.